Greetings, my scattered brothers and sisters in the Lord. Trust you know the Lord is with you wherever you find yourself scattered today, and that you know that his presence with you is more than enough for whatever you might face today. We are starting chapter 4 of 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 4, we'll take a look at the first two verses. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of their time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. Now there's a lot to unpack just in those couple verses. Christ suffered in the flesh, and therefore we are to arm ourselves with the same attitude, arm ourselves with the same intention, the same approach as Christ, because the one who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. And so think about the way that Jesus suffered in the flesh. Yes, he suffered in terms of crucifixion, his death on the cross, but he also suffered in terms of ridicule, in terms of being misunderstood, in terms of people rejecting him. And so suffering in the flesh, yes, it includes, bleeding, but it also includes psychological suffering, mental suffering, the suffering that comes with somebody looking at you in a harsh kind of way, or a way of disbelief or belittling you. And so to suffer in the flesh is not just physical suffering, it is human suffering. And Jesus suffered in the flesh precisely because he was determined to obey the will of God. And so you remember his temptation in the wilderness, 40 days fasting, take these stones, turn them into bread. And Jesus' response was that we don't live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the Father, comes from God. And so Jesus suffered in the flesh because he chose the will of God over simply satisfying his human desires. And so that's what we are called to do. That's to be what our intention is. Arm yourself with the same intention, that we are going to do the will of God, that we are not going to put our human desires ahead of obedience to God. And that would include, evil human desires, but it would also include, quote unquote, healthy human desires, that we are going to put doing the will of God ahead of whatever our desires might be, whether it's the desire to be accepted, the desire to be loved, the desire to be included, the desire for success and fame and whatever it might be, that whatever the human desires are, the desire not to suffer, that we are going to imitate Jesus. We are going to arm ourselves with that same intention of living to put the will of God first ahead of our human desires. And when we do that, we're not going to sin. We're going to cease from sinning because we're putting God ahead of our human desires. Now listen to the passage one more time. It's a very fascinating passage. Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, and just think of all the ways that he suffered, not just on the cross and bleeding, but all the rejection that he experienced across his lifetime. Therefore, since Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, the same intention, that I'm going to suffer in the flesh because I'm going to put God's will first. Arm yourselves with the same way of thinking, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, so as to live for the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. See, if I am trying to avoid suffering, if I am simply living to satisfy my desires, I'm going to sin like crazy because I'm living a me-first life. But if I make up my mind to where it's my intention that I'm going to suffer in the flesh, it's not going to be all about satisfying me, but I'm going to put God first, then I'm going to cease from sin because I will be doing God's will instead of simply living self-centeredly my will. And so Peter's serious that we need to arm ourselves with the same intention as Christ had, towards God's will first, not my will. That I'm willing to suffer because it's not about satisfying my desires, it's about God's desires for me. The ironic thing about that is when we're living according to God's will for us, even in the suffering, there is peace. That even in the suffering, we find ourselves alive because God is the one who truly gives us life. Now, I know it sounds really challenging, and it is. And we don't do this by our own strength. We do this by the grace of God in Christ Jesus, who suffered for us so that we could live God-centered, God-first lives instead of just trying to satisfy our own desires. So wherever you find yourself scattered today, that's my prayer for you, that's my prayer for me, that I would have the same intentions as Christ, that I'm going to arm myself with that mindset of God first, and that it's about His will being done rather than simply trying to satisfy whatever my passions, whatever my desires might be. God bless, and imitate Christ by the power of Christ. Have a great day.